I'm Tony Phillips from Walnut Creek, and this is the first meeting I've attended, so hello.
Your first name again, please?
Tony Phillips. And I don't know how to work this thing either.
Hi, I'm Tony Phillips. Officially on the record now.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll go to item number 2, public comment. Do we have any comments on any items not on the anything not on the agenda?
Could I speak as a member of the public?
All right, please.
I found a great poster that we could post on all our streets. I'll pass it around. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll move to item number 3, approval of the minutes. Approve the CBPAC minutes from the June 11, 2018 meeting. Do I have a motion?
That was a long time ago.
Yes.
All right, a motion from Greg. Do I have a second? A second from Bill. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, thank you. All right, item number 4, implementing the 2018 Countywide Bicycle and Ped Plan. Brad?
There it is. Thank you. I'm Brad Beck, Contra Costa Transportation Authority Senior Transportation Planner. And last July, the authority approved the 2018 Countywide Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan. And it's up on our website. It's still on the Keep Contra Costa Moving website until the end of the month, at which point it'll be taken over for another planning effort. One of the chapters in it is the implementation chapter, and I wanted to talk a bit about how we can implement the Countywide Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan. We took it to the Planning Committee and the Authority, and they both approved the basics of it. But I wanted to go through some of the key steps, the more substantial authority-led efforts, and get your feedback on how we should approach it. The Authority has given general approval, and we'd like to go into the weeds a little bit more with the Bike Ped Committee. And of course, the committee will be involved in that effort as well. So the plan had 30 separate actions in 7 categories. And those are the 7 categories, from collaboration to updating and refining the plan. But it also had 6 what we're calling substantial authority-led efforts. A lot of the work is things that we are doing now or things that we're helping local jurisdictions or other agencies do. But there are some of them that we think that the authority will take a lead role in. And these are those 6. The first one is coming up with a coordinated approach to bike share. That's something the committee has talked about. Right now, as I understand it, there are basically 3 programs in Contra Costa. El Cerrito has an agreement with Lime Bike, Walnut Creek as well. There's a program in Bishop Ranch. City of Richmond has a grant to start one in that city. And as one committee member said, the authority could take a role in coordinating the chaos that bike share can have. So we've started talking to some staff people about having a forum to get staff people from the different jurisdictions together, talk about what issues the programs that now exist have faced or generated, and how different jurisdictions throughout the county and actually other parts of the nation have what strategies they've used to address some of those issues. So that's the first one, and what I'm proposing is that we'll go through each of these and then give the committee a chance to discuss how the authority will, because I know Joanna wants to say something. So this is the first of the steps that we want to take, and it'd be something we do this fall. So if are there any comments on this particular one? Any thoughts on how we should approach it?
Now?
Hi, Joanna.
So I'm just sharing with you, kind of was interesting. Peter was there, Peter Engel. Last week, Congressman DeSagne, Assemblyman, I don't know what he is, he had a forum with Uber and Lyft talking to public transit operators and high-level board members and San Francisco Port Authority. Anyway, I was in the room as just went on behalf of my boss. And what I learned was that Lyft and Uber and all the TNCs think that bike share and scooter share is the wave of the future, and 50% of their business will be that in the future, which I was shocked.
Do you think
Bruce?
it's already owned Jump?
Pardon me?
Isn't Jump theirs?
Jump, they own Momentum, Ford. I think they bought out Ford, and then they recently bought out Lime Scooter or something. I'm not even sure. It moves so fast and it changes daily. But their, what do you want to say, mission, it was their policy directors. They're all like 12 and a half years old or something, and they'll be there for 3 weeks. That's just my experience with Lyft and Uber. But they were really bright, and they said that they are a green transportation. And I think what's going on is there's just this whole tension between transit operators who are kind of saying, we're built into the system, we're part of the infrastructure, and then these random outliers who are really going to be legit. And a lot of this has to do with when they become autonomous vehicles and all that stuff. But, they're really in the business now, they said, of bike share. And so as we build these paths, scooters, I don't know, I have mixed feelings about scooters, but it is their mission to continue to grow that business. That's what I'm just putting in there.
Bruce and then Greg. Bruce first.
Yeah, thank you. Drawing back and looking at the big picture, bike share, scooter share, whatever kind of share we want to call it, is just who owns the rolling stock. So it's obvious that since they get used a lot, there's a large latent demand. So people aren't willing to buy their own, but they're willing to rent it for $1 an hour or whatever it costs. But drawing back and looking at the big picture, we're not worried about who obeys the rules, who wears a helmet, who goes which direction on which street, all right? We're only worried about who provides the hardware according to our bike plan. That is something I think that we need to emphasize strongly here. Thank you.
All right, Greg.
So my only comment, just to follow up, is I think you should formally include scooters and electronic e-bikes as well, because those are emerging along with bikes. I've seen, Berkeley, we just got the Ford Go bikes, and now they're already talking about e-bikes. So I think you should include that as well.
Yeah, the plan does mention scooters and does have a little sidebar on e-bikes. Electric assist bikes are definitely part of the sharing ecosystem. If I can sound like I'm touting bike share.
All right, Bill.
It seems to me one of the very key problems here is cities' jurisdictions are right next to each other, choosing different networks. And you're winding up with Ford bikes in one place and Lime bikes in another. El Cerrito, for example, has gone to Lime. Richmond's leaning towards dock bikes. Somehow or another, I think this is going to have to be eventually going to have to be consistent. Tying into what you said, Ole, who owns this? Who owns the systems? It may be different owners for the two different systems. We don't know at this point. The key thing is, how do we coordinate those two, and do we designate? We say, no, you can't have a dockless system here, or a dock system, or too much flap from the public. We don't want to see these Lime bikes all over the place, which of course is one criticism. So I don't know exactly what role. It's one thing to analyze. It's another thing to enforce rule about that, about what do adjacent jurisdictions do.
If I could add something to that, you mentioned El Cerrito and Richmond. Richmond doesn't have a system yet. Berkeley does, as Greg mentioned. The Berkeley agreement with Ford Go Bike is that the city will not allow any dockless bike share within the city, so that the system, Lime Bike, in this case, of an adjacent city, can only allow Lime bikes if they park at a BART station. I'm not exactly sure how that agreement came, but the city of San Francisco had a similar agreement where, I don't know if it was an agreement with Ford Go Bike, or Motivate, which is predecessor. But the city did not allow, even though they would show up in the city, they weren't allowing any dockless bikes and requiring the dockless bike companies to come and pick up whatever bike would end up in San Francisco. And they apparently, a lot of them did eventually end up there.
You think this is wishful thinking?
Well, I've been told that they were fairly responsive. And you mentioned the issue of complaints that people have about bikes, and certainly Concord, City of Concord, and City of Walnut Creek and Pleasant Hill have all heard complaints from residents or businesses who have Lime bikes left in places that the residents and businesses don't want them left, and that includes the BART as well. Lime bikes started showing up at this BART station, for example, and the BART got very upset about where the bikes were being left, and it came to some agreement with Lime Bike about it. So that's one of the big issues. The City of Seattle used to have a docked system, now has 3 dockless systems, and they have some agreements with those 3 systems on where the bikes are kept. They're trying to work out some way that people who leave a bike, because they know who leaves the bikes, can get rated or dinged financially. They're trying to figure out a way to do that for bad behavior.
I just want one comment. Yeah, I just wanted to add, you listed those names, those jurisdictions. Actually, the county we also have an issue here with left Lime bikes here at Contra Costa Center. And that's why we have interest in this, in a coordinated approach to bike share, because, currently the county doesn't allow bike share within unincorporated counties. So we're curious how we could work with, say Walnut Creek, who does allow dockless bike share, like regulate bikes that come into unincorporated counties. So, yeah, that's our main issue, just the bikes left in unincorporated county. And from what my impression I get from communications with the dockless bike share companies, I'm not even sure if they understand, the difference between unincorporated and incorporated. So when we say, we don't have an agreement with the county, they say, we have one with Walnut Creek, and we have to tell them the county is not Walnut Creek. We're, wholly separate jurisdictions. Okay. Go ahead, Joanna.
Well, maybe this could be its own topic all in itself, because there's a lot to be said about it. The thing that I got from, again, this roundtable last week is we don't really have a choice, because these groups of bike share or ride share or whatever they want to call share industries are responsive, privately owned, nimble, constantly evolving, and they don't really care. They didn't say that, but regulations aren't what's going to drive them. They're going after what the potential user is going to want. So, Oli, I agree. We kind of are, we don't want to get in the weeds, and we are about infrastructure in this plan, and we're about expanding, infrastructure and about whatever, safety and all those other things. I don't know if any other CMA or any other bigger body than a city has tried to coordinate this. I don't know what that, I mean, bigger cities, San Francisco, Seattle, so forth, but it's kind of like, what do they call that, disruptors? That's the model.
All right, Bruce?
So my observation here is we with bike share and scooter share in 2018 are like it was with cars back just after World War I, when there were thousands of cars entering big cities, and those who were running the cities didn't have a clue how to deal with them. They were making rules about how horses were supposed to drive in the streets.
Eric?
Yeah, as I say, I represent Transpac, but ultimately I work for the city of Pleasant Hill, and for us, it was kind of like what was iterated. The city of Pleasant Hill currently does not know how to respond, nor do they know how do they really feel about the whole bike share concept. I think that's part of the problem, is because I personally, as a cyclist, I would agree that given how spread out everything is on Contra Costa County, dockless is probably the way to go, the practical way to go. Dock system is, my experience with dock system has always been that it's more for like a higher density use areas where, like, even Berkeley, even though it's a small city, but it's got a high concentration of cyclists, and a lot of destinations would impact really close to each other, mostly surrounding the campus. But that's when dock system really, it's got its advantages. It's got designated places that you have to drop off the bike or return the bike, but it's also easy to deploy the number of docks and facilities so that bikes are relatively in easy access to residents at different parts of the city. Here in Contra Costa County, especially, in Central and East County, it's in South County, it's so broad, it's suburbia, and you're not going to be able to have, very difficult to have the coverage or the deployment density for dock systems so that people, in theory, can walk quickly to a facility, check out a bike, and do one-way trips. And so that's where dockless comes in. The problem with dockless is, we all know, it's kind of a free-for-all. And that's the problem that challenges that agencies like Pleasant Hill and Concord are faced with. How do you manage a system when the whole business model is you can park anywhere, and the responsibility, technically, legally, is on the individual who checks out the bike? That's as part of their rental agreement. And cities as an end user, if the cities don't have any clear idea or place to park them, in theory, they are technically able to park anywhere they want, provided that, in theory, they don't block ADA access. And my thought process has always been the easy way going is you designate parking areas, potentially, at different parts of the city for dockless bikes. So instead of having a dock system, you either through signage or whatever, designate certain areas throughout the city to accommodate these parkings. Basically, but how does that play in hand with the company policies? And so I don't know if it's something that they're open to even, or are they just insisting on, that's not our purview. But ideally, if you can kind of have a dockless system that behaves in a way kind of like a dock system, but you don't need to have that dock infrastructure, that may be kind of a hybrid of what may or may not work, because that's something that the cities could designate where they want these things parked, and in retrospect, if we can integrate that into their app, saying, okay, these are the parking designated areas in various jurisdictions, that they tie it to where the users have to park them or check them out, you may have more or less the pros of both sides, but a discussion to be had.
All right, Paul?
Thank you. Well, I'm intrigued with Eric's comments about this kind of a hybrid between dockless and docked. So City of Pittsburgh, we adopted a resolution authorizing entering a contract with Zagster, a docked bike share. But since then, we've realized that's when dockless seems to have gotten really popular. And now I'm wondering, with all the complaints about dockless, where are we going? Are we going back to docked, or are we going to a hybrid of the two? So it's, again, we're really interested in seeing how this shakes out. How do you take care of these complaints of dockless bikes? That's all I have.
Okay, Sean, and then Greg.
Yeah, I'm excited about this because I see it's really popular, and we're at the place at the Park District where we're already, all of us here sitting here are reacting to this. Proactive is out the window, I think, at this point. We gotta figure something's going to happen here. But within any technology, there's this growth phase, I think. But what Eric said, I was thinking the same thing, just reading this, but I was thinking more bike racks in cities, just have, because the biggest problem is you just see them randomly blocking and sitting places. If they're bike racks, it could be dual purpose with pedal bikes, dockless scooters or bikes, just places where they could actually sit, and like parking areas. But anyway, what I really turned the mic on for was that the problem that we see from the Park District is that we're just figuring out, we're finishing a pilot study for e-bikes on our trail system on 3 different trails to address whether we'll allow them or not, given that certain classes are not considered motorized vehicles anymore. Our Ordinance 38 says no motorized vehicles on the trail. And so we did this study on the Iron Horse Trail, pilot project rather, Contra Costa Canal Trail, and the Delta de Anza Trail. And that study ends actually this month. And so we're really interested to see how this will change our rules for e-bikes. But it doesn't address e-scooters. And so we're like a few years behind that, I think. Those are still motorized vehicles, as far as I know. And so what's happening is there's jurisdictions adopting these policies, or attempting to, like Richmond, for example, recently attempted to pass a speed limit rule on their trails. I forget what they called it, a multi-use path trail ordinance, I believe. And then they slipped in there as well, like, and e-bikes and e-scooters are allowed on the trails as well. Well, what will happen is that they manage Bay Trail segments through their jurisdiction, but as soon as they get to the Park District jurisdiction, those people that thought it was okay will now be cited by our police. And so I see a conflict at these jurisdiction points with the rules. And so we're looking at our Ordinance 38 and things, but this is from our perspective kind of one of the big issues that we see coming. And I just wanted to share that with you.
All right, Greg?
Yeah, I just wanted to concur with Eric. Docked systems do need a high-density area. Even in Berkeley, they're in the more concentrated areas of the city. So I don't think you're going to see docked systems work here. I'm not as convinced that the parking issue will be as much of a problem as everyone fears. I mean, honestly, I could park my bike anywhere. I ideally need a pole, but I could park it anywhere in Pleasant Hill or Walnut Creek. And then the last comment I wanted to make is I just spent a better part of a week in Portland. They've had bike share for a long time. I saw a large number of e-scooters on the street, and I think those are going to emerge, and they may very well eclipse the bike share, especially for trips somewhat near the BART station where people are trying to do that last mile to BART, from BART. So I'm not suggesting necessarily we focus on that, but I think that's going to be an emerging trend, and I would predict it'll eclipse the bike share around here.
Bruce?
2 follow-ons, one for Eric, or actually one a follow-on of Eric to the CCTA, and that is whatever we said in our plan about parking, we need to jump on it. And then a follow-on to Sean with regard to electric bicycles and scooters on our multi-use paths. This is just a general observation. If these capable 30-mile-an-hour vehicles start running up and down our trails, the mothers pushing baby carriages and the fathers trying to teach their 5-year-old how to ride a bicycle will disappear. These will go from our paths, whether they be city-owned or East Bay Regional Park District owned, will become roads, no longer sidewalks, it seems to me. Thank you.
Joanna?
I know we can debate and keep going on this, and we have other things to do, but as a follow-on, I think when we do this plan again, which is every 4 years, oh, well, you're not going to, whatever. Someday when we do this plan again, we're going to be behind the 8 ball. This is a constant reality of planning, especially in today's environment. We're just kind of like catching up, and if we were to stop the process and start talking about e-scooters and all that stuff, and I agree, I was just in Portland, and it's like, Portland's kind of a college town. I mean, it's low density, but I mean, kids hop on scooters because it's, I don't know, easier, I guess, or something. I don't know if we can address this. I think it's kind of like we're too cumbered, big, large agency that can't we are not nimble.
That's true. And it is hard to make predictions, especially about the future.
All right, Tony?
Yes. So I agree with everybody, which is good, I think. But I agree with what Eric said, that I think forward bikes and docking bikes are a pain because you have to walk, and so it's a lot more convenient to put your bike where you want. But with line bikes, you can just lock them up by locking the wheel. There are other bikes out there where you have the U bend on, where you're forced to lock them at least against something. So that would help unblock sidewalks and maybe stop some of the complaints that people are getting if you chose to go for that style of bike.
Yes. The different bikes do have slightly different technologies. Though if you see a line bike and try to move it, sometimes I think you hear a voice saying, "Don't move me, rent me." But I appreciate all your comments that helped focus our approach to the forum, which, as I mentioned, we'll try to get to this fall. But in the interest of time, let me move to the next one. There are 2 others that we're going to try to do this fiscal year, or at least start. And the next one is something that was mentioned by Commissioner Butt, or Mayor Butt from Richmond. And that addresses the issue of not knowing as much about pedestrian facilities, where people walk, and what their needs are as we do about bicycles. Because in some sense, bicycles are more like a vehicle, and that they operate much more like a car or a truck than a person. So in the plan, we have this pedestrian needs assessment that's got 4 basic steps first to assess the network, to figure out how much of it is missing, or the ultimate or best facility, a network facility, are missing, how much it would cost to fill in those missing pieces, and then finally to identify some guidelines on developing and maintaining the pedestrian system. We don't have any budget for it yet, but in what was approved by the Planning Committee and Authority, we will address how much it's going to cost, and it will require consultant assistance to do this. It'll take some more budget, so we'll address that in the mid-year budget.
All right, any questions? Bill?
I would just say that as the assessment develops, it's very important, actually early on, to walk the system, not just look at the maps, but be right there. When we were developing the Richmond master pedestrian plan, we had bike plan and pedestrian plan at the same time, but they're separate. One day, for example, Janet Abelson, the former mayor of El Cerrito, who is in a wheelchair, led us around and showed us all the various areas where they're problematic, for example, driveway aprons and so on. And we should do that with pedestrians, not just look at the map and see where the sidewalks are, but actually physically go around. And I think we can get volunteers to do that. It's entirely possible.
Bruce?
Could I say something in response to Bill? This is one of the issues that we have to figure out. There are many, many miles of sidewalks, and the county is a very big place. And there are different approaches to trying to assess the network. We could do something like we did for the Safe Routes to School needs assessment, where we made some assumptions about what's needed within the walking radius or bike radius of a school, and assume that it would cost a certain amount to fill in those pieces. That was the basic idea. That's something we could do here and make some assumptions about what's needed and how much is missing. Or we could take a case study and actually look very closely at a couple of different types of places and using what we found in those specific places, extrapolating it to the county as a whole. So they're different, or we could try to get a much larger effort and actually try to walk every single street and look at every crosswalk in the county. Some jurisdictions have already compiled their information, but not most, I think, or at least they haven't shared it with us. So that's a sort of the least and the most effort that we're looking at.
Yep. Perhaps you just simply start with the areas that are most heavily traveled and do as much as you can, and maybe later on you can get to the areas of the county where there are fewer people.
All right, I'll have first Bruce, then Greg, and then Sean.
I'll hold off. I'll go to the end of the line if you want.
Greg.
To your question, I really think this should be a focused effort. I mean, if we've got people within a half mile or a mile of BART and they're driving because there's no good way to walk there, that's a problem. So I do think it ought to be a focused area prioritized on traffic, volume, distance, density. The second comment is I wanted to take what Bill said a step further, and yes, I think we should walk these areas, but I think we should walk them at night, because I think lighting is often an under-evaluated element of pedestrian access, and you can have a perfectly good path that no one will use because it's dark and seems dangerous. So I would build in lighting to the assessment.
All right, Sean.
Yes, so what you mentioned, Brad, about the taking a sort of case study look at things. So I see that playing out, like for the process. I see that maybe this committee would have a say in what types of areas that you would look at, right? So from the Park District perspective, obviously, I care about how these pedestrian facilities connect to our regional trails. From a city, obviously, commercial areas, transit, things like that. So it would be, I think my need for information, I would love to have every, sidewalk mapped in the county, but it seems really impractical. Like, we kind of know where we need it. I think we can kind of assume where these hot spots are adjacent to things like from a connectivity perspective, at least. So that's my 2 cents. I'd like that's it.
All right, Eric.
Quick question, Brad. Do we know, I'm sure you actually probably know this already, I'm assuming not every city in the county has their own bike and pedestrian master plan?
Many do. Compared to 2009 when we did the previous plan, a lot more jurisdictions have come up with their own plans, and there are some that are in the process of it. San Ramon just finished their bike plan. Walnut Creek did a PED plan. I can't remember the status of their bike plan, but they're doing both separately. I think Richmond finished yours after we did the 2009 plan. Pittsburgh is in the process of doing a plan now, bike plan, bike and ped. So most of the jurisdictions have got some form, either one or the other, or both.
Right, because
But
like
not
you said,
everyone.
right, because like you said, it's kind of a large animal to chew, and you can't take it in one bite. So just recommend maybe perhaps, I understand most of the agencies either have, I don't think most of these agencies are developing from scratch. They're either updating the previous plan or, I mean, some are developing from scratch, but the fact that most of them have already have some kind of document that shows where the existing infrastructures are, maybe just take that, kind of like what you did for the countywide bike and ped plan, compile all the information, make that your inventory, so to speak, and then maybe perhaps for the, I do agree we do need to walk some of these things, but then for the limited resources and time, just to walk the targeted areas where we know there's a huge density, because I don't think it's realistic to walk the residential neighborhoods, for example. I mean, which sometimes your average resident don't even want sidewalks. But if they have it, it's shown on the plan, great, at least we know it's there. But you definitely want to focus your walking, the limited resources on the downtowns and the transit areas, mostly maybe even more on the transit areas, because it probably has the most concentration of walking, and just kind of take it that way. At least is a reasonable starting point to get the 90% accurate assessment.
Yeah, let me give you an example of two different approaches. The City of Concord's bicycle, pedestrian, and safe routes transit plan, they had enough funding that the consultants could, using Google Street View, look at every street in the city. And they do have a list of all the pedestrian crossings and sidewalks and where the missing pieces are. City of San Pablo's plan, on the other hand, only looked at their main pedestrian, what they considered their main pedestrian facilities, or the streets. Those were the more heavily trafficked streets where they thought the need for better pedestrian facilities was greatest. And in that sense, maybe it is about connectivity, as Sean suggested. So those are two different approaches that have been taken. It wasn't about San Pablo wasn't about a focused area as much as it was about major streets where safety is more of a consideration.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of our experience too with planning documents or bike and ped plan in general, is you can take a 60,000-foot elevation view of a broad area, or you can take a, street level view of a particular corridor and spend the same amount of money. And so, so I would say probably as a combination of both, kind of what we were talking about is some of these less dense areas, you take a 60,000 elevation assessment, and then the areas where we know that, okay, 90% of the pedestrians or cyclists are in these higher density concentrated areas, those you take a much more detailed level assessment and needs. That's kind of what you're saying.
Bruce?
This is not to denigrate Tom Butt, but I was at the CCTA board meeting where he spoke, and it sounded to me like he had flipped through the 200 pages of the bike and ped plan and noticed that there were more words describing bicycles than there were pedestrians, and he was making that observation. I think it was a little bit of, this is my analysis now, not anybody else's, I think he was mentioning a little bit of sour grapes on this document. Okay?
He did make those comments, and it was more on the, look at how many pages there are for bicycles and how many there are for pedestrians. Doesn't this seem wrong? But he did follow that up with a much more detailed comment that listed those 4 bullets, slightly different wording, but basically those are the 4 components that he wanted the authority to include. we didn't have time to do it before the adoption of the plan. And as we've been discussing, there's some issues on how we actually would do it. But he did at the final analysis understand that we did beef up the pedestrian section in response to his comments at the meetings.
I do not dispute that.
There's one small glitch, and I agree that we should start with the looking at the city's bicycle pedestrian plans that if they exist. The general recommendation is to update those plans every 5 years. Now, I don't think it's going to happen too often that the cities are going to look for the money to do that. But that does mean that a fair amount of change can happen between the time of the plan and the time of the update. So there may be a fair amount of work that needs to be checked at that point. It's probably more likely it'll be updated every 10 years or something in that range. We're supposed to do it, and not very much has been done.
All right, Bruce.
I would like to say that a follow-on to Mr. Butt's comments, and that is, in our analysis, we should look at arterial streets that don't have bike lanes and don't have sidewalks, and we should certainly concentrate on those. We should also concentrate on arterial streets that don't have bike lanes and have minimum narrow sidewalks, ADA minimum 42 inches wide, because arterial streets are routes of regional significance for motorists. They're also routes of regional significance for bicyclists. They're also routes of regional significance for pedestrians. And if there are no bike lanes on this arterial street, the bicyclist is going to be on the sidewalk fighting with the pedestrian. So let's give them a wide sidewalk, because the likelihood of us widening that arterial street is minimal. That's first point. Second point, it seems to me we got to get pedestrians across freeways, which are barriers to passage. We got to get them across the Contra Costa Canal, which is also a barrier to passage, and we got to get them across railroads, which are barriers to passage. And we all know that the railroad owners don't like to cooperate at all with anything ever, period. End of discussion. And
now, Sean will dispute that somewhat.
You have to see that.
And here's an illustration on an illustration. The Delta peddlers have complained to Caltrans for years that we cannot get across Marsh Creek Road, which is Highway 4 on the south side of Brentwood. The county, as soon as we complained to the county, put in a push button so we could get across one of the streets here. But the three streets that we want to get across, Caltrans, Walnut Boulevard, and I forget the other two streets, Caltrans said, we're not going to install push buttons so the bicyclist on the side street can get across this 60-mile-an-hour street because there are no sidewalks. Therefore, we're not going to put any pedestrian push buttons in. You know, that was basically the index finger to the bicyclist trying to get across this Caltrans facility. So I think we need to address that. And I'll shut up if somebody else wants to speak, but I got one more point.
Let me take Tony here, then come back. Sorry, Tony.
I agree.
Which is that the walking is mostly in neighbourhoods, and so I agree you need sidewalks along arterial routes, but in my neighbourhood, for example, kids walking to school take shortcuts through neighbours' gardens to connect the networks up. And the thing that I think is missing is just alleyways and cut-throughs that would encourage people to walk rather than drive the long way round. And also our local school has a one-way street coming up to it. So cars coming from that one direction can't get there. So all the kids walk to school from that direction just because it's quicker and easier. So there's ways of encouraging walking by making cut-throughs, I think, that you should consider as well.
I think Sean, and then Bruce.
Well,
I was making a joke because you said the index finger, so I went ahead and, which is a better finger in some cases, most cases. To me, when I was reading this, it's what I think. I can't remember what it was, whether it was in the trying to develop the TEP for Measure X or what, but setting priorities, I think, is the key. The thing that you can wrap your head around in this plan, so that local jurisdictions know what's a priority through direction from hopefully the Transportation Authority, someone who knows better, or has some recommendations that everyone can agree on. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road, is for funding and for guidance and for implementation of the best pedestrian network that you can get, the most connected, the safest.
All right, Bruce.
Yeah, my final statement is the local cities are where the pedestrians are, so the local cities have to be significantly involved in picking out where the sidewalks need to be and where the missing segments are. So this flips back onto Tom, say, cough up some money, big boy.
It's 11:50. We can go on to the next one. Really, for this subject area, we can get lunch and then come back at say 10 after, and then continue, because I need to get through the first three of these things, even if we don't finish it up. Just so I can get direction for the next steps in the process.
Okay, or John.
Ask for clarification. Item 6 is upcoming subjects for discussion. That seems kind of open-ended. Is that really, like, we could talk about this until 1 o'clock, or we can talk about this and try to wrap it up, and then talk about the things that we didn't get done, like forming some sort of a bike share, scooter share forum or something?
Well, I would like to get through this item, even if it extends into, and we reduce the amount of time spent on item 6, which may or may not take that much time. I would like to mention what happened at the Active Transportation Working Group. That will only take about 5 minutes to do. Well, there are 16 of them, but five of them we don't. 5 of them we don't need to talk about.
Just for clarification, Brad, are we focusing only on, there's six items? Are we just focusing on the first 3 today and then the next 3 at another?
I'd like to focus on the first 6 of them.
Oh, the first 6.
The major authority-led efforts, just to get some feedback on those. But if we only get through the first 3, that would be okay. There's one more of the big 3, and that's the Vision Zero idea, and I want to go through a few things on that. But there are some other things I'd like to get through as well. Your feedback is really helpful on what we've gone through so far.
Maybe let's break for lunch first and then come back. You said 12:10?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, we'll adjourn to lunch. I'd like to reconvene the CB PAC meeting. Brad, if we want to move on to the third item.
Thank you. The next implementation task, and this is one of the first three we want to, this is number 3 in the first 3, is about Vision Zero and systematic safety, sort of the key words in this approach. And what the plan says, and I put it in quotes, support a countywide Vision Zero policy and systematic pedestrian and bicycle safety analyses, using a data-driven and systematic assessment of the leading causes of traffic injuries in the county. The authority will support its partners in identifying efficient and cost-effective engineering countermeasures. And I've got a not particularly easy to read little graphic here that talks about the Vision Zero ethical platform. And it's a summary of the idea, one of the key ideas behind Vision Zero. And it starts at the top with the system designers, that designers design the system, and then road users, they just have cars, but all road users are supposed to follow the rules that are set up by the system designers. And then if they don't follow the rules, then the designers have to start to redesign their system so that people are less likely to violate the rules. Or if they continue to violate the rules, the consequences will not be as severe. So the focus of Vision Zero is about minimizing fatalities or eliminating fatalities and severe injuries, not to eliminate all injuries, but to try to minimize the impacts that occur. If there's an accident, that it's a severe injury, not a fatality, or just a minor injury instead of a severe one. So all of the Vision Zero programs in the United States that I know about are local jurisdiction ones, and there are several cities in the Bay Area who have Vision Zero programs. San Francisco, not surprisingly, Sacramento, not in the Bay Area strictly, but in Northern California, Oakland, but also Fremont, which is more like developed in a way that's more suburban and which is like many of the jurisdictions in Contra Costa. But they're all single jurisdictions. So one of the big questions is how would the authority, what role could we play in helping local jurisdictions implement a Vision Zero idea? This is one of the other things that we want to hear from you and to come up with some scope of work that we can get a budget for and take to the authority to get approval to do. And it probably would be something on an ongoing effort in trying to identify, to do the safety analysis systematically to get the information that's needed to help jurisdictions. So that's the basic idea.
Sean?
So how, how closely tied or partnering with this policy in this document? I'm eating a chocolate chip cookie right now, and it's on my mind. The county is doing a Vision Zero plan right now, right? And so how are these two related, is what I'm trying to ask.
Well, Robert's also eating a chocolate chip cookie.
I'm eating half of his chocolate chip.
Well,
That's cute.
I'm not directly involved with the county's Vision Zero process, but from the best of my knowledge, I don't think there's been any collaboration between the county and CCTA. I think part of I think this is what would have been one of my comments. One of the difficulties with a county-wide approach is, as you're aware, Vision Zero requires, planning, engineering, but also enforcement and like some educational aspect to it, and I guess like enforcement, I'm assuming all the jurisdictions are going to have different levels of enforcement. So I guess that would be the thing. We'd have to coordinate that part of it. I mean, here in this group, yeah, we could do the planning and engineering, but just the other aspects, like coordinating that.
That's definitely the case. The jurisdictions are going to have to play a major role, definitely the major role in actually carrying it out. But the authority, as this policy suggests, as this action suggests, wants to help jurisdictions do that. And if there's some role that we can play, perhaps in helping on education or doing some analyses, we are funding 501 Contra Costa. Maybe there's some way of expanding that role or something similar to that to help educate people about Vision Zero, to educate jurisdictions about effective countermeasures. The best practices appendices do have some things. It has measures and the crash reduction factor associated with those measures. But looking at, or maybe it's identifying particular locations that in whatever monitoring period has the highest accidents, fatalities, and severe injuries at those locations, and working with jurisdictions to identify some countermeasures for those particular locations. We don't know what that role is, and that's the purpose of this task.
Bill? There's a couple of recent bits of technology that should be factors in most of the Vision Zero approaches have to do with cars hitting people and blah, 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 or signage, that kind of thing. But I own one of the zillions of Priuses around, and what you immediately notice is that pedestrians and bicyclists do not hear you when you're coming up on them. In a couple of very close situations I remember being in. We're going to have to develop some kind of warning system. And, maybe something that sounds like a bicycle bell, who knows. But maybe the county should start thinking about that sort of thing. There's one other thing. It sounds like it's in the future, but not too far. Cars, as they're working on driverless cars, they're working out communication system between the cars. In fact, I just saw an article about, which language are we going to use, which one? Should we be thinking about any kind of system that communicates with bikes? Or, I don't know. There's just some things to think about that we might want to, might add to the mix of thinking about Vision Zero.
Greg?
So one thing that is missing, and I know we can't influence driver education per se, but there's zero driver education on bike and pedestrians and their safety in this country. Just as an example, I think Bill was saying he got doored. Why does that happen? It's because someone doesn't look. But in other countries, as I understand in the Netherlands, you're trained as part of your education to look, so no one gets doored. We can't affect the DMV, but I think what CCTA could do on a countywide basis is to look at education and outreach and look at what we can do to increase driver education about unsafe behaviors. I think it gets too complicated, but to start looking at individual cities and where is the least safe intersection and look at implementation of specific measures in each city, maybe one place to start would just be education and outreach.
Bruce?
As a follow-on to Bill, I do not own a cell phone. However, I bet somebody could develop an app that would go from the cell phone to the car or to the cell phone in the car saying, hey, there's a bicyclist around here. If that happened, I would buy a cell phone and carry it with me all the time on my bicycle, just to keep from getting run over.
Make sure you keep it charged.
Keep it charged. Charged is good. A second point I'd like to say is the more bicyclists and pedestrians, the more aware the motorists are going to be. If they never see one, then they don't look for them. But if they're all over the place, whether they're going the correct direction or not, whether they're following the rules or not, if the motorist has to be aware that, uh-oh, I better keep an eye out, there's got to be a bicyclist around here somewhere, then the motorist is going to be paying a little more attention. So we want to encourage more people to ride bicycles. Sounds counterintuitive, but I think that's the answer.
Joanna?
I'm fighting the noise behind me. So it's interesting, the education piece of it and the density of bicycles. I mean, there's that whole theory, bird on the wire. You know, the more birds on the wire, the safer they are because they can fly up together and they cue each other. Has anyone heard that theory? Okay, so I'm not out there. I think when I ride the Ohlone Greenway, because it crosses so many cross streets, people are really aware. For the most part, you can tell that people have seen bikes before, and sometimes they're not always going to stop, but they are. Enforcement, mainly because I deal also on the other side of the freeway with HOV lanes, is going to make people, I mean, if you have to ding them with the ticket, you have to ding them with the ticket. El Cerrito did that a lot, and then I think El Cerrito realized that what they really needed to do was build better curb, bike interface, pedestrian interface. And so they got a grant or they got money and they're doing massive improvements along the London Greenway between the BART stations. So I think it's just, over time, I think it's a good idea, Vision Zero. Technology can answer some of the pieces of it, but it is about education and enough bikes or pedestrians that people get used to it and start to drive accordingly.
Eric?
Brad, maybe another question for you is, I know you're trying to get directions here on how to implement or comments on implementing a countywide Vision Zero policy. What do you envision? Just because, professionally, I'm a traffic engineer. So a lot of what Vision Zero is really doing to me is just what I normally do on a daily basis, or try to do. Assessing, reassessing, design things to make it easier, better access, but more importantly, coming up with designs to minimize injuries or lessen the degree of injury, which most of the time means slowing people down on the street. If you can slow traffic down, people will die less. I mean, it's just the way the nature of the beast is. Same amount of collisions, but the severity of injuries will naturally decrease. So I guess from a policy standpoint, is the intent to have a countywide policy to basically what?
Well, I think there's a couple of steps in the process, and the first thing, and it's the first step in most things, is to get everyone on the same page. And that's the reason I put up that little graphic, is that the Vision Zero approach is a little different. You can read more about it. I mean, the Wikipedia page is a good starting point. VisionZeroNetwork.org is another good website, though it's a bit basic. But it does have a comparison between what they describe as the traditional engineering approach versus the Vision Zero one. And one of the Vision Zero tenets is that people screw up and they get themselves in trouble, and then they get hit, and then they get killed or severely injured. And the trick is that you try to design the system and operate it in a way that prevents those or minimizes the impact of them. So that's the first step, is just getting that idea out and then getting the authority and their jurisdictional partners to buy into that idea. And then how do you actually figure out where you need to put your effort, where you need to put your money, beyond the education part, which is essential as well. And then that involves data collection and analysis. And that could be a role that the authority plays, is helping in that data analysis. But really, its first step is to get the idea out, get an agreement on what the authority's role should be in carrying out Vision Zero in Contra Costa, and then finally, what role will we have in doing the data collection and analysis?
Joanna?
Quick question. So what's the difference between Complete Streets and Vision Zero? Where do they overlap?
Well, Complete Streets is a street that has facilities for all, that are safe and connected facilities for all the people who use the street, for all the modes of transportation that use the street. They don't necessarily have bike lanes on them on every street. They don't necessarily have truck facilities where trucks are not a major part of the users there. But it's mainly about incorporating all the types of facilities. The Vision Zero idea is more about how to make sure that they're safe when you design them. Vision Zero, for example, has an approach for freeways where the only modes of transportation are cars and trucks. And in that case, there's designs about the lane widths and curvature and all that, but also speed. And controlling speed is one of the key components of Vision Zero. And there are some what Americans would probably find to be excessive restrictions on speed in certain kinds of streets. But they're shown to reduce severe injuries and accident and fatalities quite successfully. Sweden was the first. That's where Vision Zero was invented, and one of their first steps was to set very stringent speed limits on their facilities. Except sunbathing in the winter.
Bruce?
Thank you. One thing we could start out doing would be to change the fault pattern. Usually it's assumed that if the person gets hit by the car, that it's the person's fault, riding the bicycle or walking. And we switch that, and the person has to prove the person that got hit has to prove that it wasn't their fault. Let's switch that around and say the motorist has to prove that it wasn't his fault or her fault for running into the pedestrian or bicyclist. That'll be a tough sell. That'll have to be statewide or maybe even nationwide, but that's certainly a more that goes directly to the problem. You got a 4,000-pound car against a 150 or 200-pound person, and physics says who's going to win there. So we got to throw some of the blame on the 4,000 pounds.
All right, Tony?
So my experience is that in our neighbourhood we've asked for traffic calming from the city and county, and it's always turned down. We've asked for speed bumps and we've been told they're not safe because cars can swerve around them. We've asked for narrowing streets and we've been told fire trucks can't get through. We've asked for crosswalks and told that you can't put a crosswalk on every intersection. And now they've started putting in bike lane markings and by the school crosswalks signs. So things are actually getting far better than they used to be, but forever the city and the county always found excuses not to do anything. So I don't know if that's changing.
Well, as it is changing over time, and I've been around for long enough to have seen some of those changes. There are still issues with putting in crosswalks. They sometimes, depending on where they are and what the demand is for them and how much traffic there is and the configuration of the intersection and how much sight distance there is, they may or may not actually help the situation and sometimes give pedestrians a false sense of security, but they can be very helpful at the same time.
But just things like central, I don't know what you call them, medians, where a pedestrian can cross half the road and get halfway across and then cross the other half, and cars also have to slow down to get through that. Simple things like that appear to me to be very effective, but the city's reluctant to do it. So I think there are lots of cheap, simple things that could be done still.
Bruce?
Cheap, simple things are good. It is much safer for the bicyclist or pedestrian to cross the street when there aren't any cars coming. However, the rules say you wait until the traffic signal changes without regard to the amount of traffic on the street. So then the bicyclist or pedestrian has to rely on the motorist to be aware of what's going on, to obey the rules, to stop at the red light, so then the bicyclist can go or the pedestrian can go. So maybe change the rules a little bit and go a little bit like Idaho and say, if you want to cross the street, go ahead and cross the street when there are no cars around, because then you won't get hit by a car if there isn't any car there to hit you.
Joanna?
Back to the 30,000-foot level. Why isn't Vision Zero something that the state adopts? Because that's what one of his feathers in his cap, your boss, was that he got complete streets adopted at a statewide level. And it's not a problem that's unique to the county. It's unique to, whatever, the world. But it is something, I think, that doesn't really need to be discussed. Or we don't have to take all our energy and time. It should be done somewhere at the statewide level to have a Vision Zero for California. That's my 2 cents.
Sean?
Yeah, I'll just second that, just because a lot of what we're talking about is back to Bruce's comment about making the motorist more at fault than the bicyclists, et cetera. Those are laws. Those are that's changing the DMV. That's a bigger thing. But so the quote here says support a countywide Vision Zero policy. So create a policy, support it, and then move on. Does that sound good?
Motion made, seconded.
I think it's just a question of what does support mean? And, it could be that the authority's role is just to help come up with a policy and then do some data analysis on a periodic basis to help with jurisdictions. But, that's the question, what will the authority do?
Eric?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of this outside this county's level or influence. I think, like I said, in my experience, it's been, if you want to, because I was thinking what's really, from a design standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, from a construction standpoint, what's the main difference between complete streets and Vision Zero? And Vision Zero to me is, like you said, it's an extra level of intent to minimize the severity of injury, not really to have no accidents, because it's going to happen till the end of time as long as we have vehicles and pedestrians or whatever. But and the key aspect of it is the one element that's not in the county's jurisdiction or control, and that's the setting of speed limits. Now you can say, the setting of speed limits has been a much controversy for decades now. Obviously, it's at a state level. And even at the federal level, it's on part of the MUTCD requirements, otherwise you can't enforce. And basically, general summary of it is the speed limits are set based on how fast people are going on that street. And you can't artificially set it less or it's not enforceable. And so again, going back to the chicken and the egg scenario, the chicken in this case, people started thinking, okay, from a complete street standpoint, you make the roadway narrower, road diets to help to naturally calm the speed of the vehicles on the road naturally. So indirectly, after the roadway construction is complete, you go ahead and do a follow-up survey, you possibly, hopefully, reduce the speed limit. Well, yeah, so, and we've been trying to do that, and maybe that's realistically speaking, without having any influence on the state level. You know, if the state's saying, okay, we're adopting Vision Zero and we are rewriting the policy of setting the ability to set the speed limit, that's a game changer on its own. Without that ending like that, the only thing you can do is, at this point, really, yeah, we can go ahead and try to go countywide, city to city, and everybody's kind of adopted Vision Zero policy, but really, what does it mean? It really doesn't mean a whole lot. I mean, the other thing the state authority can do is you can probably on the future grant application saying, okay, we add some criteria for saying anything that the project is proposing have some form of Vision Zero type improvements, meaning you don't have to do this, but you're doing it to, for example, slow the speed down, right? Because a good example, you take a 3-lane arterial or a 2-lane arterial, for example, and you have, let's say you can just go ahead and stripe a bike lane in. Technically, if you do that, it's meeting complete streets, and you just say you build a sidewalk. Vision Zero, to me, is one step further in saying, okay, I go ahead and do a road diet. I don't need to, but I do it because I really want to slow the speed down on this corridor, so even if people make a mistake, the chance of fatality is a lot less, right? It's going to cost a lot more money, a lot more outreach, and agencies just won't do it because what's the incentive to do that? I mean, monies are tight, and yeah. So I think that's a complete psychological fundamental change in thinking process if we really want to be serious about this whole Vision Zero concept. Otherwise, it would just really be, it's part of our document, and we go ahead and do outreach to all the different agencies, and we get a resolution from every council saying, oh yeah, we have a Vision Zero policy, but that's pretty much it. And so I think it's a good start. Maybe it's an educational piece of it, that people know what it is, but I get a lot of pushback myself, just from an implementation standpoint. When I do road diets or whatever, the residents of all people will be the first one to say, "What's the delay?" I know as a state we're moving away from level of service, from a environmental review and impacts analysis. But if you talk to the normal driver and normal resident, they don't know level of service per se, but what they're talking about is how am I being delayed? Basically, is level of service. And so I think there's always been a disconnect. It's always could be a disconnect between what the engineers and the planners and the policymakers, what they want, what they're setting, and the people who are actually driving and calling in and using it, people who are ultimately getting involved in these kind of things. And I'm just maybe saying too much of the obvious.
Bruce? Could I follow on with what Eric just said? And that is, your average motorist wants speed, does not want to be delayed. That's the problem right there, because this country is founded on rules. They don't apply to me. I can do whatever I want. That's the attitude of the entire country. The motorists have it, the bicyclists have it, the pedestrians have it. Screw the rules. I need to get somewhere fast. So Eric is absolutely right. I would like to say that I read a statistic, I think in this document, that said 70% of the fatalities are on 7% of the facilities, or something like that. I might not have the numbers completely correct. So if we're going to go for Vision Zero, let's concentrate our effort on those 7% of facilities that are providing us with our fatalities. We want, by our design, to make it easier for everybody to do the right thing rather than to do the wrong thing. So we certainly want to narrow the street on the one hand. On the other hand, we want to keep the bike lanes. I mean, it's certainly easier to narrow the street by getting the bike lanes gone and just make it narrow. If the bike lane is there and the car lane is there, the motorist is going to see wide open. On the other hand, we want bike lanes. So there's the dichotomy right there. So certainly don't remove bike lanes. But the problem is the motorist wants speed.
All right, Bill. When we when the city council accepted and passed the Richmond bicycle plan, naturally it involved things in the future like road diets, et cetera. And they said, yes, we like this plan, but we want you to do one thing. When you come to implement part of it, contact the residents. Go to we have a city, we have a neighborhood council system in Richmond, for example. So you go to a neighborhood council meeting. Let people know about it. Now that doesn't mean you don't have to do it. And you can have a discussion. You may have this, this is in the plan, and eventually you go ahead and do it, unless you get tremendous objection to it. But I think that diffuses it a lot, rather than suddenly the trucks appear and they're restriping the street. So also, you need to tell people about the success of, say, road diet somewhere else. If you don't have anyone nearby, in Marin Avenue and Albany, one of the first ones was put in, was built in our area, which allowed bike lanes in both directions. And it had been a fairly wide 4-lane street with people buzzing along. And the year after it was constructed, accident rate went down 35%. Most people didn't know that, but that's the kind of thing you'd want to publicize for anything in the future. But I think it's possible with relatively minimal public contact. You want to have a public meeting or two or something in a given area. But it really does diffuse the situation when you don't surprise them. So that would be one of my recommendations.
Perhaps we could move on. It's about 10 till. Let me just run through the other three just to mention what they are, and for you to think about what happens next. One of them is to set short and long-term priorities to review safety, connectivity, accessibility, potential for mode shift to set those priorities. Here are two examples of a priority setting method. The one on the left is from Seattle's bike master plan. And it looks like all the bike projects, and then it looks at the ones on the citywide network, and then the local connections, has different sets of criteria for each, and then sets priorities based on those, and then melds them together using a more qualitative process. And the first set is all quantitative, and then they came up with their larger list. The one on the right is from Memphis. The Memphis MPO. It's multi-county, multi-state MPO. It's about the same size as Contra Costa in population and area. And what they did was a very thorough GIS analysis to come up with, and this is the pedestrian one, by the way. They did one for bicycles as well. And then they came up with where the facilities are most needed, and the red ones are where not surprising, that the places with the greatest density is where you saw most of the pedestrian priorities. It's a little bit different for bicycles, a little more spread out. But that was a very quantitative approach. So those are the two approaches that the authority might take in setting priorities. The next one is something that we do as part of our implementation documents update, and that's to look at what kind of methodology for using bicycle and pedestrian improvements as CEQA mitigations, and how those mitigations those projects can reduce the amount of VMT generated by a development. And then finally is an improved wayfinding system. I find this a good way to think about the system that you might generate. There are three basic types of sites besides sort of the more detailed kiosk information ones that you see in downtown areas. And basically you have one set of signs for when the bicyclist needs to make a decision on which direction they go. That one is from Portland. The confirmation one, this one's from Oakland, is where you show that you're on the right track to get to those particular destinations and how far they are. And then finally there's the turn one, which it shows you the route, the best route to take to get to those particular locations. So what the authority could do in this instance is to come up with that set of destinations and a general set of criteria, and then to make sure that adding those signs is a requirement of getting Measure J funding for different projects. And I won't go through the other actions, but you can read about them in the plan. And they're ongoing things and particular things that the authority staff will do. Like we'll be on the TAC for the Iron Horse Trail connectivity study. So with that, that's my end. I appreciate all your feedback that you've given me on this.
All right, we'll move on to item 6, upcoming subjects for discussion.
Yes, if there are any items that beyond, I'm hoping to bring some of these, the big three back to you to talk about what we're doing. That would be one of them. But if there are other things that you think that the BPAC might fruitfully weigh in on, the activities that the authority does.
Greg?
I just wanted to make one comment on the last three. I saw you had something on CEQA mitigation, and I've seen CEQA used to stop projects, and I've also seen it as a way of getting mitigations put in for bike amenities, and I think there's an opportunity there. And so I'm not suggesting that CCTA be in the business of suing developments to put in mitigations for bikes, but I think it's something that we might want to look at, and how we can use CEQA as a tool for bike ped mitigation.
That would be one of the outcomes. It's not necessarily intended to get those improvements, but by showing that you can take a reduction in the expected or forecast VMT impact, that it would be a way of providing the basis for requiring those bike ped projects as mitigation.
All right, Sean?
I guess this is kind of an item 6 thing. It's a little bit of a question and probably a comment veiled as a question. But as looking through the ongoing efforts and things, I see the growth management program, a lot of issues in here that were, that some of us in this room were heavily involved in the TAP formation on the EPAC for Measure X. And there was a lot of debate, a lot of outside efforts and coordination that came up with, in some cases, not the best recommendations. I didn't agree with everything that happened in there. Nobody ever really agreed on everything. But there were other cases where a lot of really helpful information was developed through that process. And I'm wondering how the authorities treating that information. Is it now, well, that didn't pass, throwing it away, let's go back to the drawing board, or can you go back and look at that information and use some of it to maybe get us closer to something that people will agree to on certain things, especially the growth management program and other elements that moving forward in future plans?
Well, if the authority does move forward, there was a lot of frustration among the authority board members about the result of the process, namely that it didn't pass.
Yeah.
But I think that when the authority does, if it does resurrect the effort to have a new TEP, a new sales tax measure, or an extended sales tax measure, that they will look back at the work that was done and not just start completely from scratch. And we'll start from those earlier efforts.
Joanna?
I don't usually go to the authority board meeting, but the last one was Wednesday, and my bosses had twins. Say that because I have twins. So he's out on paternity leave. So I went to the board meeting, and what I heard was that they do want to go ahead and do, and I didn't quite understand, a strategic plan and relook at, I mean, they were like all about 2020, let's see if we wanted to bring this back. So I think you're right, Sean, a lot of work's been done, a lot of information still relatively fresh. If it's going to pass, it has to have a different angle. I have my own opinions, that's irrelevant, but I don't think it had enough of some things and too much of other things. So I think that's really relevant to seeing how we can tie then this plan and go forward in implementing pieces of it.
Okay, if there are no other comments, I can just update you a bit on the Active Transportation Working Group. This year, the ATWG has tried to do every meeting as a theme, and the theme this time was equity. And there were a lot of interesting information about how you analyze and the efforts being made to analyze how different transportation improvements or investments are affecting different communities, and whether you should make improvements because you'll end up displacing people from one community by putting in bike lanes. One of the most interesting was the second to last one, the urban design and mental health, and the effect of one thing I hadn't thought about was that the need not just for social interaction, but what they called social reprieve, that some people have social reprieve, that some people have a problem with being overstimulated, especially people with autism, that going to, say, a farmer's market is very difficult for people who have trouble dealing with too much stimulation in their lives. So that was very interesting. And there, as you can see, there are a lot of efforts being taken in the Bay Area right now around the issue of equity and how different communities are influenced, including about mental health and health in general. There are only 2 presentations, and if you're interested, I could try to let you know where those are.
All right, Bill?
Just a quick question. Do you have representation on that committee from indigenous groups and Black and Latino community?
I don't know there's any specifically from those groups, but at this particular meeting, the groups were all about representing those communities. It's mostly meant to be for groups that are focused and staff people are focused particularly about active transportation, as the name implies.
I believe Transform's on that group, and that's one of their missions is to represent the underrepresented and people of color and inner cities. So,
yeah, 2 of the presentations were from Transform staff.
Yeah, And I think it's a come one, come all. I don't think I mean, is there appointment to it? It's just anyone can be on it, right? It's information only.
Well, it's not anyone can be on it. You are asked to be on it, but one may attend without being asked.
Sean?
I'm not surprised you've gone without being asked, Joanna.
Thank you, Sean. Next time showing up at your board meeting.
You're invited. Is there any discussion in this group or at all? And I think everybody's sort of like blinders on about Prop 6, and the effect that may have on active transportation funding. Is there any thought, or are we just waiting to see?
Well, staff people have, we're not supposed to weigh in. The board members can weigh in as individuals about whether voters should or should not vote for any particular proposition. It's pretty clear that the majority, if not all of them, are opposed to Prop 6 because of its impact. But we haven't, I think we have shared information that Alameda CTC put together about the impacts of the proposition, and that we've shared some of that information, but not in a formal way.
Any other questions? All right, we'll move to item 8, other business / information sharing. I guess anything else?
I do have two bits. I apologize that I did not introduce Wilma Van Hook, who is our new planning assistant. She is, a month and a half? 6
weeks.
So we're very happy to have her around to help with all this. So if you want to find out what's going on with meetings, she can answer questions as well. And the other one is that I'm going to be retiring at the end of this year on December 28th. So 21 years is more than 21 years. Yeah. And I actually worked on the first congestion management plan in 1991 as a consultant. So why? Well,
we got a new plan in before he leaves.
Well, I got the plan done. It looks good. I like it. And I'm going to be trying to do consulting, probably not as a full-time, but maybe full-time part of the time and no time part of the time.
Yeah, thank you for everything, Brad. Yeah. So.
Make sure you transfer all your information and knowledge to your successor.
All right, Bruce.
Could we have an informal, off-the-record discussion about who thinks that Prop 6 is going to fail and who thinks Prop 6 is going to pass? I'll start, if that's okay. Oh, okay, sorry.
All right, any other information? All right, if not, item 9 will adjourn. Our next meeting is scheduled for November 26, 2018 at 11.
We may end up changing the date, moving it up a week to avoid Thanksgiving. I'd forgotten about that.
Okay, so stay tuned for an email from Wilma.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Welcome, Wilma.
Thank you.
Now we can talk about Prop 6. I think the tax is going to be voted away. I don't like that, but I think that's what's going to happen. Anyone want to convince me of otherwise?